A very warm welcome. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. This is the Booms and Bus Show. My name is Jonathan Davis. It's Monday, the 26th of February. My God, 2 months of the year gone already. 1/6. My word, where does it go? I am not joking. The Booms and Bus Show is about free markets, about capitalism, about libertarianism, and showing up cronyism, fascism, communism, socialism for what they are. Packs of bloomin' lies. I thought for a change I'd start the show with me. So here I am talking on the radio thingy with a certain George Galloway, that well-known free market capitalist that he is. Just on Friday night, so that would have been Friday night, the 23rd of February 2018. George and Jonathan, take it away.
Talk Radio. Now, Jonathan Davis is an economist and a wealth advisor, and so I wanted to talk to Jonathan, and I'm grateful that he's given me the time on a Friday evening to talk about the customs union and the possibility that Jeremy Corbyn, it is only a possibility, we've had no official word on this, and no one close to him has given me any steer. So it's either that Corbyn is going to execute a U-turn on Monday in a speech, or he isn't. And I want to explore the implications of both. Jonathan Davis, welcome to the show.
Hi, George.
Now, I was saying earlier, you might not have heard me, that to be in the customs union is not the same thing necessarily as being in a customs union, a bespoke, tailored, special arrangement between Britain and the EU. Do you share that view, first of all?
Well, I think legally and technically you're probably accurate. I think in practice, unless we leave the EU full stop, we are therefore still partly in the EU, and that is very problematic for me. It's a bit like being a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. If you are a bit, then the way politicians are, then incrementally they'll take us back in gradually and imperceptibly.
Well, that's my view entirely, even using some of the same words as I did. Great minds think alike, especially if they're both Scottish. We don't have to look in the crystal ball, Jonathan. I've just heard it come out of the jackal's mouth. Tony Blair just said exactly what you and I are saying, that if Britain is to continue to have a close economic relationship with the EU, and he's talking about the customs union, it will have to follow EU rules. And if we follow EU rules, we haven't left the EU, and therefore the 17.5 million who voted to leave the EU will have been betrayed.
And I said the day that Theresa May became leader of the Conservatives and therefore the Prime Minister, I said, I wonder whether or not we're actually going to leave the EU. And she has said repeatedly, Brexit means Brexit. Well, the problem is politicians say a lot of things and then they do the opposite. There's no question, all she's trying to do is save her job. Talk about short-termism in the scheme of things. Talk about not caring about what the country wants. And when I say the country, of course, 48% voted to remain, but the fact is we had the vote. And everyone involved at the time in June 2016 said, we will implement your decision, you're being the British people. Well, we made the decision. All of a sudden, it's Parliament who's got a say in it.
Well, a veto. They've got a veto.
Well, perhaps they do. But Parliament doesn't have a say in it as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't do, because they all said at the time, we will implement your decision. And the vote was very simple. Do you want to stay in the EU or do you want to leave? There was no, do you want this or do you want that? I see one of the papers saying, we don't even know what the 4 alternatives are. As far as I'm concerned, there is one alternative. There is only one route, and that is entirely to leave any legal relationship with Brussels, with the EU Commission. We become self-determinant. We decide our laws. We don't go with the European Court of Justice. And the idea that we have to be in a or the customs union, we have to be in the single market for this industry and that industry, but maybe not for this industry and that industry. In other words, it's pretty vague. The idea that that is implementing the will of the British people, well, you know, it's as ridiculous as Chamberlain in 1938 coming back from Munich, having seen Mussolini and Hitler and whoever the French guy was, saying, I have the paper, there'll be peace in our time. It's
I just watched Darkest Hour. Maybe I'll talk about that later. Truly moving and tremendous movie. And the analogy that you make, some might think a little far-flung, but actually, when you think about it, this is an existential challenge to British democracy. Parliament and democracy will be gravely damaged if the feeling is amongst millions, not the whole 17.4 million, maybe, but amongst millions of British people, that they took an important decision and it was betrayed by politicians.
Absolutely. And we hear time and time again of many of the Remain voters who accept that the vote took place. And then you consider also that every single one of the establishment organisations that said that the UK economy would go to hell in the handcart, if even we voted to leave, never mind we actually left, and have been proved absolutely 100% to have been talking stuff of nonsense. When you add those two things together, you can reasonably estimate that if this vote happened again, it would be 60% to leave and 40% to remain, a resounding vote to leave. That is how I read the British people, the sentiment today.
Well,
even some MPs, many MPs who voted Remain said, well, you know, we had the vote, we need to leave.
Well, I share that view, although I have to live and work in a bubble in central London. I'm going all the time from TV studios to radio studios, filming, film sets, and so on. And it's easy.
Terrible, George.
It's easy. It's hard work, but somebody's got to do it. It's easy to get the false impression that Brexit is no longer wanted by everyone around you. But of course, it's how this plays in Porthcawl, in Preston, in Poulton-le-Fylde. These are the places where, in Peterborough, these are the places Labour needs to win and keep if it's going to form an election. I think Jeremy Corbyn will be making a grave strategic political error if he executes a U-turn on Monday to please the metropolitan elite and their media and their mandarins. What do you think?
Well, you know, this is now party politics. I think that Corbyn, MacDonald, Abbott, I think they make mistake after mistake. In any case, on this particular point, it seems to me no doubt that on the one hand you've got the Tory cabinet, which is split down the middle, and that's why we've had a fudge for a year and a half. On the other hand, although Corbyn and MacDonald apparently say we're going to Brexit, You've got the likes of Thornbury and Abbott who say, no, we can't do that and all the rest of it. So they both seem to be split down the middle. I think the followers of Momentum and Corbyn and McDonnell, actually, I think they'll just do whatever is the opposite to what the government says they want to do. Whether or not it's right, I think they'll just play party politics and do the opposite.
Lastly, I made the point earlier that if we are in the customs union, it's not just that we're not able to make tailored trading arrangements with all the other countries in the world, though that is serious enough.
Yep.
It is that the decisions of the EU on all matters of trade policy will apply to us. So that, for example, and I gave as an example the steel industry, which was virtually destroyed by the dumping of cheap Chinese steel on the British market. We would not be permitted to halt the dumping of cheap Chinese steel unless the European Union did it also and first. Now, to what extent are you therefore not in the EU, if that's the case? To what extent are you an independent sovereign country again?
Yeah, well, as I say, you can't be a little bit pregnant. Whenever I think about the customs union, I think about our costs of food. I think about how we could be importing food from African farmers. How many decades have we cried at the sight of starving kids in Africa? And yet, because of EU tax tariffs, African farmers can't really much export into the EU because it costs, no one can buy their stuff because you have to add on such a massive tariff. If we were to leave the EU, if we were to come out of the customs union, we could set our own, maybe free trade, 0% tariffs, or whatever it is, but certainly it would be a tiny fraction of the tariffs that the EU have set up, shall we say, to keep the French farmers in their Mercedes and Range Rovers. No,
well
they don't really buy British Range Rovers.
Well said, Jonathan.
But one final point.
Yes.
One final point, very quickly. The idea that if we leave the EU, that we will no longer be able to buy Mercedes, BMW. I'm telling you, the chief executives of those companies will be banging on the door of Frau Merkel saying, we need the UK. This is what I said in speeches before the referendum, and that's the simple point that's not being got across here. They're still saying it will create economic difficulties if we leave the EU. Stuff of nonsense.
Jonathan Davis, economist and wealth advisor, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
So yeah, that was me with the communist, therefore totalitarian, George Galloway on the radio thingy on Friday night, just 2-3 days ago. I think it was a pretty good discussion. To his credit, Galloway is anti-EU. I don't quite get why he's anti-EU, but he is nonetheless. And why did I think I would play that today? I hope you found it interesting, perhaps a stimulating discussion to consider. But today, of course, we heard from the Labour Party in the UK under Jeremy Corbyn, who for 45 years of being a professional politician, he's been anti-EU. All of a sudden, Labour, indeed Jeremy Corbyn himself, comes out and says that Labour wants to have a relationship in the, or a, as Galloway was saying, single customs union, and discuss trade deals in partnership around the world. In other words, no change to what we've got, a little bit pregnant, as it were. So McDonnell, the communist, and Corbyn, the communist, have decided to throw away all their principles for power. Well, of course they have. They're socialists. It's what socialists do. This is, of course, the Jeremy Corbyn great betrayal of the Labour leavers, particularly from the Midlands to the north of England. As Galloway said, from Porthcawl to Preston, they're going to say, I can't believe what the Labour Party has decided to do here. As to where those Labour voters will go, I've not the faintest idea, but they're certainly not going to help Labour in whatever elections we have between now and the general election in, 2022? Because, of course, there's going to be council elections. There's not going to be European elections, silly me, because there's not going to be any British members of the European Parliament once we leave the EU. I see, following Corbyn's announcement, that Theresa May's spokesman said, quote, "The government will not be joining a customs union. We want to have the freedom to sign our own trade deals and to reach out into the world." Well, that's all fine and well, Mrs. May, but let's actually see this is what you're doing, because by all accounts you had this big 8-hour meeting at Chequers with your cabinet last week, and we got total fudge coming out of it. In other words, we still have no idea, when you say Brexit means Brexit, what it actually means. What's interesting is that William Hill, the massive bookies or bookmakers in the UK, they've now got May as an odds-on that she is not going to be the Prime Minister from some point in 2018. They've got her on odds of 10 to 11 that she will be kicked out. Now, will she be kicked out by the Remainers because they've taken hold, in which case Britain is dead forever? Or will she be kicked out by the Brexiters, in which case for the next 20, 30 years, Britain's got a better chance of survival than any country in the EU other than Germany? Well, we'll see. We'll see whether or not William Hill knows what they're talking about. An interesting fact is, should we Brexit, 80% of NATO total spending will come from non-EU members. Remember why NATO was established? It was to defend EU countries. How frightening is that? Well, no doubt there'll be a change in NATO funding, I've little doubt. So that's my little Brexit piece. I want to thank Rob Butler, who kindly emailed me following last week's show. I talked last week about the Berlin Wall, about Herr Dietmar Schweitzer, who was shot dead trying to escape the communists. And he wrote, "Your most recent podcast mentioning Dietmar Schweitzer reminded me of when I was on cycling holiday that took in part of the Iron Curtain Way. This was last year, 2017. It's about 2 meters wide. It was built of 1950s reinforced concrete. It was, as I saw it, an unassuming path through pleasant countryside on the border between the Austrian and the Czech Republican borders. It was the border between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. How interesting. He says, I assume it was a communications road for the Warsaw Pact troops, hence the width for a jeep, just over 2 meters. As we cycled, we passed several notice boards that at first glance looked like nature boards, telling perhaps the story of the local flora and fauna. We stopped by one, and I then realised they were erected to mark the spot where someone had been shot trying to escape the communist dictators into the freedom of the West. This was a shocking revelation. The guard towers and machine gun emplacements are still in situ. He says the Iron Curtain Way is a must-see for any libertarian. He said, my socialist brother-in-law, with whom I was cycling, was ashamed. Well, Rob, again, thank you so much for writing to me, and I was glad to be able to read that out. Your socialist brother-in-law is a total and utter lying numpty. He should not have been ashamed. He should be a free market libertarian capitalist because he knows that's what the communists did to the people fleeing communism. As if, these socialists, it's suddenly a grand revelation. Oh my, is this what happened? As if they've never been to the movies. Now, Rob Butler contacted me on my email at jd@theboomsandbustsshow.com, jd@theboomsandbustshow.com. I would love you to contact me there and tell me how you experience the show. If you have any experiences that you want to pass to me that I can then, as I've just done, present to the other listeners like that. Certainly, you must be a follower on Twitter. If you're on Twitter and you're not following the show at Booms Busts Show, then there's something not quite right. So you click to follow the show and you'll get a lot of good stuff on my Twitter feed. And I might mention, if you're listening to the Booms and Busts Show, then you really should also be reading the Booms and Busts report, which comes out every 2 months. It's entirely free, just like the show. Just send your name and email address either to the Twitter account or email it to me. Mugabe in Zimbabwe, another fascist socialist who took over when Rhodesia got its liberation from Britain, became Zimbabwe. I just want to mention what Grace Mugabe has been saying, arch socialist, cronyist, billionaire, of course, while most of the country is starving. I mean, this is socialism. Do you not get this if you're a socialist listening to this show? She said, very clever lady, girls have a higher chance of getting pregnant than boys. Any doubts about communism, fascism, socialism, cronyism, if you have any doubts whatsoever, just look at China, economic growth, markets doing well, and, we're big investors, fantastic. At some point we won't be. And just to show you how totalitarianism is what matters, power is what matters in socialist, fascist, communist countries. Xi Jinping has just appointed himself, or is in the process of appointing himself, the president for life. This cannot happen in a liberal democracy. It can only happen in a totalitarian state. And if anyone believes, he's quite a young man. I think he's still in his 50s, maybe his very early 60s. If anyone believes that over the next 30, 40 years, China is only going to ascend economically, you're in cloud cuckoo land, not under a totalitarian dictatorship. It doesn't happen. Moving on to something very serious indeed. Listener, let me remind you, you're listening to the Booms and Bust Show. My name is Jonathan Davis. This is Monday, the 26th of February, 2018. In August 2017, 17 men and 1 woman were convicted of attacks on 22 women and girls aged between 13 and 25 between 2011 and 2014, following Northumbria Police's Operation Sanctuary. The perpetrators who've been sentenced were Abdul Sabi, Habibur Rahim, Badrul Hussain, Abdul Hamid Manoye, Jahangir Zaman, Monshur Chowdhury, Tarul Alam, Hassan Ali, Nadina Aslam, Muhammad Azram, Yasser Hussain, Saiful Islam, Aiza Musavi, Prabhat Nelly, Mober Rahman, Nashiruddin, Radwan Siddiqui. Do you get my point? They say victims of Asian grooming gangs. Asian? I think you mean Muslim, you lying. Have told of their horrific ordeals as a report revealed today that the, quote, arrogant, unquote, abusers felt, unquote, unlikely to be prosecuted, unquote. A serious case review found the gangs preyed on 700 girls, not 22 women, girls and vulnerable young women in the northeast, before a major operation was launched to stop them. Experts have revealed that those targeted by sex predators on Tyneside are likely to need lifetime support to help cope with the impact of their ordeals. Last week, details of some of their horrific experiences were revealed for the first time with the publication of the 150-page report. During interviews with the report's author, victims told how they were raped while under the influence of drink and drugs. Quote, I never had sex when I was sober. I wanted to leave. I was given drink. I kept saying no and fighting them off. I was very tired and fell asleep. When I woke, I had been raped. When I was asleep, I was raped. Unquote. Another victim told how the abusers used the drug mephedrone, otherwise known as MCAT, to control the girls. She said, they gave it to the girls. MCAT was cheap, makes you like a zombie and wanting to keep going. It's addictive. It makes it easier for them to get what they want. When I was out of it, they could do anything they wanted to me. Unquote. A total of 22 young women gave evidence at the trials, which resulted in substantial prison sentences. But the review estimated there were around 700 victims in total in the Northumbria police force area. The only abuser to help the inquiry, help I would put in inverted commas, was an asylum seeker who had spent 10 years in Turkey, around 5 in Greece, and sometime in Italy and France, and hoped to get to Canada. Oh, that's nice. He exploited a 15-year-old girl and later showed no regret, telling the inquiry team he was only convicted, quote, because of a conspiracy by the government, police, and the judge who paid the victims, unquote. Are you sick yet, listener? The report said abusers were, quote, not consistently investigated, disrupted and prosecuted, unquote, before 2014, and notes that, quote, Early responses had the appearance of blaming the victims for their behaviour and allocating them responsibility for making bad choices, unquote. And it's still happening. And if you know of anything at all like this, or you have any idea, any semblance of suggestion this might be happening, you need to do whatever you need to do. You need to save the girls if you know anything about this going on. So, journalists, more regulation for Facebook. Journalists, more regulation for finance. Journalists, more regulation for sugary food and alcohol. Journalists, more regulation for advertising. Jeremy Corbyn comes along and he's really teed off that the journalists have found out that he was regularly meeting communist country spies before the fall of the Iron Curtain. Corbyn says, more regulation for journalists. And journalists, so this is how democracy dies. Journalists are what I would pick up on my shoe. Now I'm liking more and more this guy, King.com. That's his Twitter handle. He's taking the New Zealand government to law. He's suing them for the paltry sum of $6.8 billion. Because this was the guy who invented the way to share popular music, recorded music, free of charge. The American government and basically every Western government shut him down, imprisoned him, and therefore he lost his business, which was, of course, going to be absolutely immense. And then you got Spotify, which, of course, is owned by the mega tech corporations, which are themselves controlled ultimately by the government. So you might want to check his handle out at kim.com. He said just yesterday, as it happens, the biggest enemy of the US isn't Russia, China, or Trump's effort to have good relations with them. Your biggest enemy is a deep state that profits from conflict. The CIA is a business. Every war, terror attack, and crisis means more money for them, so they cause war, terror, and crisis. He then put up a couple of photos, the first one being Julian Assange. It says, "Hi, I'm Julian Assange. I give private information on corporations and government to you for free, and the media calls me a criminal." And the next photo says, "Hi, I'm Mark Zuckerberg. I give your private information to corporations and government for money, and the media call me Man of the Year." Oh God, I hate Facebook. Now, I've for years railed against the housing price explosion economy that we have in the West, particularly in Canada, Britain, Australia, and it's all to do with, keeping interest rates lower for longer and easy lending. In other words, bailing out the banks. Well, I want you to get out the smallest violin ever and listen to retired economics professor. This guy is obviously a genius economist. Do you think he might be a socialist? David Tha and his wife Paula Maisonville, they're from Canada, from Vancouver, who's also a retired teacher. When did teachers ever know anything about anything? So they own a home in Vancouver's Tony Point Grey neighbourhood that they bought 31 years ago. That'd be 1987, for 370,000 of your Canadian dollars. Now, the house is worth $6.5 million. And of course, it's gone up tax-free. Now, it makes them eligible to pay slightly higher taxes under new measures introduced in the state's budget, British Columbia's budget. Properties valued at higher than $3 million will be subject to a 0.2% tax on the value between 3 and 4 million, 0.4% on the value over 4 million beginning in 2019. So they calculated they're going to have to pay just about $12,000 in additional taxes each year, which is not in their budget as pensioners. Quote, this is where you get your tiny violin out. Quote, I'm beside myself because I'm looking at maybe another 20 years here and I don't know how I'm going to be able to afford the tax, unquote. The 72-year-old said, quote, we're going to be taxed to death and we'll be forced to move. My whole standard of living is shriveling before my eyes, and it's all a result, in my mind, of inept political decisions, unquote. You're a blooming economist, you numpty. Because of those, quote, inept political decisions, unquote, you've made $6 million bloomin' dollars. Why don't you sell the property and live off the income? What's 5% of 6 million? 10%, $300,000 a year. You could rent a place probably a great deal nicer than that and have a lavish lifestyle and probably still have $100,000 a year left over. And you would not be paying the property taxes. You total, utter numpty. And it's the same all over the world, listener. People have made vast tax-free sums on flats and houses that they bought for a relative song 30, 40, 50 years ago. And goodness knows, why don't they cash them in? I'll tell you why they don't. Because it's the consensus, absolute belief that house prices can never fall sustainably. Well, what I'd ask you to do is go on to dailyreckoning.co.uk and read my essay, article, whatever you want to call it, my piece on house prices, particularly if we have started an era of rising interest rates. Now, you should go on to the Booms Bus Show Twitter account. It's the easiest way to listen to the show. Just go on there, click on the pinned tweet on the account, scroll down, click to retweet. Why don't you do that? Why aren't the hundreds of people who listen to this show, why are you not just clicking RT? That's all you have to do. Click RT. Retweet. Why are you not doing that? Please do it. It's all I ask of you. I tell you, I'm deadly serious. If over weeks and months I don't see a gradual trend upwards in the number of A, downloads and the number of B, retweets, I'm telling you, I'm going to kick the podcast into touch. Now, if you don't like it, fine, stop listening. But if you get something from this show, whether it's the politics, the economics, or the investment markets, retweet. That's all I ask you to do. Scroll down again and you'll see charts and photos that I'm talking about on this show. There's a great chart of GDP forecasts for 2018. And the forecast for global growth 2017 to 18 is 2.7%. This is from the Economist Intelligence Unit. In other words, the Financial Times. You've got some really high growth forecasts. The most interesting one is got to be India at 7.7%. India, an amazing place to invest. Ethiopia, 7.2%. You know, if you start from a very low point and all that. China is around 6%. What else is grabbing my interest? Britain is looking at around 2%. Venezuela is the worst performing expected for the year. Socialist state, naturally, the economy is expected to fall 11.9%. Absolutely fantastic, fascinating, chart. You can see the colour gradings there as well. The darker the green, the greater the expected growth. And of course, the darker the green is what you see in India, parts of Africa, Asia. You generally are not seeing it in the developed economies. Next chart shows US inflation since the 1950s to date, as well as in dark blue the US interest rate. Note that US inflation is materially higher than the interest rate. That suggests the interest rate is going to rise. I've been talking about it for months. And indeed, the US last week sold 2-year Treasury notes at the highest yield, 2-year yield, since August, get this, 2008, the highest in nearly 10 years. I've been talking for months, as I say, how it looks as if interest rates are rising globally, and we may be ending the era of falling interest rates and moving into an era of rising interest rates. I should say that short-term bond markets are due a bounce. So if you're heavily short government bonds, in other words, heavily long interest rates, just bear in mind that you could see bond prices rising a few percent. And if you wonder about the inverse correlation between bond prices and interest rates, think of it this way. You'd think logically, if interest rates fell long term, house prices would rise. And vice versa, if interest rates rose long term, you'd expect house prices to fall. In a very similar way, interest rates fall, bond prices rise. Interest rates rise, bond prices fall. I'm increasingly bearish government bonds. I'm increasingly bullish global index-linked, inflation-linked bonds. I rather suspect that that could be the trade of a generation, in the sense that it could be whereas global government bonds has been the risk off for decades, I wonder if index-linked bonds could be risk off for the next 30 years. Who knows? We shall see. Very interesting chart talking about stocks and bonds falling at the same time. For decades, when stocks went down, bonds went up. I talked a lot about this recently. And when stocks went up, bonds fell. Well, there is a chart of showing the percent of days in the year when stocks fell 0.5% on the day and bonds also fell. Now, it's from 1989 to 2017, and it showed that basically the norm was that you'd only see about 8% of the time when stocks fell 0.5%, bonds also fell. Isn't it interesting that year to date 2018, 20% of the days when stocks fell 0.5%, bonds also fell. I did ask the question recently, what if government bonds were no longer the safe haven that they've been for decades? That means any investment portfolio, pension, ISA, stocks and shares, ISA, whatever, bond bond as in life assurance bond investment portfolio that's got a sizable amount of government bonds, you just want to look into that. If we're in an era of rising interest rates, I've said it already. I read that Goldman Sachs, they say, is considering selling their office property in the City of London. A £1 billion valued property. Why would, and the idea being that they will continue to work there, but they'll lease it. A sale and lease back deal. Why would Goldman Sachs sell their £1 billion London property and lease it? Well, it's pretty darn obvious, isn't it? I well remember 2007, HSBC sold its Canary Wharf skyscraper to a Spanish financial outfit for an amazing hundreds of millions of pounds. Amazing in those days. And they did a sale and leaseback for just 3.2% of the value of the property. That's what their rent was going to be, 3.2%. And not long after, we started to see the biggest financial crash in history. It was only some weeks later we saw Northern Rock. And I wrote about it at the time. And I said, this is it, readers, this is it. If the banks are selling their own properties. 2 years later, the Spanish outfit went bust. HSBC bought the property off the liquidators for an absolute song. Why is Goldman Sachs considering selling their London base? Go figure it out. You want to be in property, you want to be in buy-to-let, you want to be in a high-priced property that you've built up over the years by doing nothing, by just being there and paying off the mortgage? Or what about if you've got a big mortgage? Think about it. Think about it long term, not short term. And no, when it hits the fan, when sentiment changes sustainably, you will not be able to get out of that property. Gold and silver, the next chart. Lovely pictures of silver bugs and gold bugs. It's showing the ratio of the price of silver to the price of gold. And it's showing it from the 1970s to date. And it shows that silver to gold is at the point where for the last 20 odd years, silver has then rallied hard versus gold, and that has been a bull market for the precious metals sector. So, big picture, the precious metals sector, it seems to me, is in a huge bull market, which started as long ago as over 2 years ago. Little picture, I'm not so sure. I'm seeing short-term strength in the dollar, short-term weakness in the yen against the dollar, and that normally goes hand in hand with weaker precious metals. I'm seeing minor stocks weak, and, you know, they could go down heftily within a couple of weeks. It doesn't alter, even if they do that, I'm talking about 10 or 20%, it doesn't alter my big picture that the dollar is generally in a downtrend, the yen is generally in an uptrend, and until major supports are taken out by gold and silver and miners, I remain bullish. Remember, this is what the boys in Wall Street and the city do. If you're in a market, they know what you're in. And they push and they push and they twist that screw, and they make it incredibly painful to hold on to something that you really want to hold on to. You sell it, and I tell you, you generally sell at the lows and you buy at the highs. Now, I hasten to say, I was not a gold bug from the end of 2010 till about the end of 2013. I was practically not in the market at all. I had maybe a 10% exposure out of what we came to have in late 2016. So I didn't buy back until late 2016. I was largely out of the market from the end of 2010 till the end of 2016. That is, of course, well, is that 5 or 6 years? I can't remember. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 6 years, silly me. That was 6 years I was largely out of the market. I've been in the market heavily for 2 years. And, you know, it hasn't been a comfortable 2 years. But we bought relatively cheaply. And I haven't sold, and a lot would have to happen before I do so. But, you know, you do your due diligence. General markets, 80% of S&P 500 companies have reported on their quarterly numbers. Of 11 S&P sectors, 10 of them have shown positive earnings growth. We are seeing 15% year-on-year earnings growth. Q4 revenues are up 8%, and 2018 earnings are estimated now, get this, to be 19% up year-on-year. This is not what you see in bear markets. Now, Warren Buffett, the legendary investor, the founder and chairman and chief executive still of, he's no longer the chief executive. He is the chairman of the board of Berkshire Hathaway. He is no doubt the greatest investor in the history of the world. And his annual chairman's letter is always something you have to read. Google it, it's very easily available. From 1965, since the current Berkshire has been around, he was, of course, an investor before that, to 2017, the S&P 500 grew on average 9.9% per annum, a total return of an astonishing 15,500%. Berkshire has seen a 20% per annum on average return. 2,400,000%. In the, what would that be, 54 years, he has had 4 major crashes in the Berkshire share price. If you don't know about Berkshire Hathaway, it's a holding company that buys into other companies. It doesn't do anything but invest. well, of course, it does do cash management and treasury operations, but yeah, it doesn't produce anything as such. And it invests in companies like American Express, Apple, Bank of America, Bank of New York Mellon, Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, General Motors, Goldman Sachs, Moody's, Philips, Southwest Airlines, US Bancorp, Wells Fargo and Company, and so on. Those are their biggest investments. They make up about $145 billion. Total stock holdings are $170 billion. He's also got over $100 billion in cash. In fact, in total, they've got investments of something like $350 billion. One company. Between March 73 and January 75, the share price fell 59%. From October 87, in fact, in the space of just 3 weeks, the share price fell 37%. That was the October 1987 stock crash. From June 98 to March 2000, it fell 49%. From September 08 to March 09, it fell 51%. Now, the point being, crashes happen. But if you're invested well, you'll make vast amounts of money. I want to mention one thing about Warren Buffett. In 2008-9, he had the potential to be the greatest American ever. Because this is the guy who said, if you lose money for the firm, I will be understanding. If you lose reputation, I will be ruthless. 2 points. Many of his investments have made money because of bailouts, and the bulk of his investments have made money because of QE. How did you make all your money, Warren? Well, consistency and judgment, and doing the right things at the right times. You know, I wake up in the morning, I have a cup of coffee. I drive myself to work in the same car I've owned for 3 years. I've lived in the same house for 45 years. I buy myself a bacon and egg burger on the way to work. I read the Wall Street Journal. Oh yeah, quantitative easing. He didn't make all that money because he's a capitalist. He made all that money because he's a cronyist. Talking about you and me making money, look at the chart of emerging markets equal weighted against the S&P 500. That's a happy face to me. That shows to me that emerging markets across the board against the S&P is on a rise. Now, that doesn't mean the S&P is going to lose money. It means that it suggests that emerging markets equal weighted are going to make more, whatever the S&P does. Just a quick look at the S&P 500 chart. We saw it fall from roughly 2,900 to 2,550. As I speak, it's 2,760. It's recouped the bulk of the late January, early February fall. You know, it could easily go back again, back down to 2,550, which is the 200-day moving average. The fact is, it's been at the 200-day. It's on its way back up again. I'm not surprised. We should be bullish. Quotes of the week. Yeah, talking about South Africa. Let me just turn off just turn on the mute, should I say, on my mobile phone. I'm getting WhatsApp tings. You might have heard them. Friedrich Hayek, Nobel Prize winner. The Road to Serfdom. If you're interested in this stuff, you want to read it. When Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party back in, what was that, 1975, was it? She became leader of the Conservative Party. She slammed the road of serfdom down on the Tory party headquarters and said, "This is what we believe." Greatest lady ever alive. Next week, I've run out of time. In fact, I'm way over time. Next week, I'm going to play you Reginald D. Hunter on Margaret Thatcher. Friedrich Hayek. The system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less for those who do not. If there is no private property, there is no freedom. Go and speak to the Zimbabwean and South African farmers. Now, if you've got kids and you're wondering about why they're social justice warriors and anti-fascism, when in fact, of course, the anti-fascists are the fascists, you might want to listen to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said this: "To endure is the first thing that a child ought to learn, and that which he will have the most need to know." I'm a parent myself. So true. I don't know who said this, but in the similar lines, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you handle it. And Morgan Housel has said on Twitter, podcasts are underrated, more accessible than books and more thoughtful than blogs. If you want your friends to hear the Booms and Bust Show, simply retweet it. Why have we got hundreds of listeners but only 20 or 30 retweets every week? One has to ask the question. As ever, listener, I've had an absolute blast. I will see you next week.